Stanford University.
Welcome. For those of you taking the course for credit, this is EE380 by the way. For those of you taking the course for credit, I hope you are doing your reports as the lectures occur, because if you don't, you tend not to finish. And we're approaching the end of the quarter. As you walk downstairs, those of you who came here live, you walk past a brass plaque that listed inventors of the internet. There's one name not listed. Today's speaker, Bob Metcalfe, because he had, for some reason, the idea to do it at Park. Strange thing. But it's sort of odd that we talk about Fortran as being the language that, we don't know what supercomputing will be done in 100 years, but the language will be called Fortran. The same is true of networking. It will be called Ethernet. And networking is boring at this point, because every few years it's another factor of 10, and if it's $40 at Fry's, blah, blah, blah. So I guess that wasn't enough. And he has moved on to a more energetic use of electrons, namely energy. Thank you.
That it?
That's it.
I thought my name was on the plaque downstairs.
Upstairs, I don't think so.
I was here for the celebration.
I think you got hosed.
Oh well.
We'll correct that.
I may have been hosed, but I don't feel hosed. So.
We appreciate the hat nonetheless.
Well, thank you. There's two reasons I'm wearing the hat. One is that even though I spend a lot of my time at MIT now, I was a consulting associate professor here from 1975 to 83. The other reason I'm wearing the hat is that I'm an annoying speaker, and I find that this may tend to diminish your impulse to throw things at me, because I'm sort of home, home team hat. And I've just come, several of us have come, Ron and Robert. We just came from the new engineering building that's being built, where there's going to be what I call an Ethernet shrine that we're endowing over there, and we went to see the progress on the Ethernet shrine in the new engineering building. And I also wanted to say you're about to see my first ever PowerPoint presentation, which is ironic because I was on the board of the company that developed PowerPoint and sold it to Microsoft in 1987 for $14 million. But since I annoyed Bill Gates along the way, it's actually a keynote presentation because Steve Jobs is probably even more annoying than I am. So, and incidentally, I view PowerPoint as one of the, you'll see how I broadly, when I talk about internet lessons, I think PowerPoint is part of the internet. It's part of the blossoming of communication capabilities that came out of the internet proper. And what I'm going to talk about today can be summarized, as you will see in subsequent slides. I'm going to be annoying, and I want to talk about energy. And at some point, I'm going to try to convince you that the color green is a bad choice for energy, and that a much better color is blue. Now, I got into energy because when the new president of MIT arrived, Susan Hockfield, she did a study over first year, and she concluded at some point that energy is the next big thing. The internet was the last big thing, and we're all done with that, given the previous testimony about how boring it is. But not conceding that point, the next big thing is clearly energy. And Susan said that, and I'm a trustee and an alum of MIT, and I'm a team player, so I signed up, and then I had to figure out what that meant. That is, what does it mean to sign up? And it's my day job is venture capital. So one of the ways that I signed up was I started making energy investments, and this is a partial list of our energy portfolio. And as a venture capitalist, I would now spend the next hour going through this portfolio and bragging about it and trying to recruit you to work there and all this. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. This is one of the manifestations of what it meant in my day job to switch, as many internet tycoons have. So I'm not the first, I'm not even the best, but you know, there's Vinod and John and Tim. These are all internet tycoons who have now picked up energy. Well, I'm happy to be on that list, not heading the list, but joining the list. And that's a controversial move right there, because I am undeniably an internet person. I mean, I've been working on the internet for 5 years by the time this drawing was appropriate. What I have to remind younger people, not too many of you here today, but those big circles, those are actual one computer, or maybe two, or in the case of Stanford and MIT, maybe 3 or 4, but not 1,000 computers. In those days, there were very few computers. But this is where I'm from. So the energy people say, what is your basis for being in energy? What do you have? You know, we've been in energy since the beginning of time, and you internet people are showing up, and you really have no business here. So, and that's a fair attack. So what I've decided to do is to have, in addition to my energy investing, is to take on this intellectual exercise, which is to study internet history and look for lessons that we might reasonably apply to accelerating the solution to energy. So that's, and my standing is, I know a lot about internet history. So that's my standing. That's why I get to talk about this topic. But when I get to making analogies between information and energy, but that's when the trouble starts. Now, this is not the first, I'm not the first person to make this analogy. I mean, Claude Shannon made this analogy when he called it entropy, information entropy. He was alluding to Carnot's thermodynamics. So this is an old analogy, but one I think, and I'm going to convince you between now and 5:30, which I understand is the normal time for ending. Is that correct? Yeah. 5:30. And by the way, if anyone would like to ask a question or make an argument or anything at any point, you should feel free to do it. Would someone have a question now? Please? How about just to break the ice, someone do me the favor of asking a question.
All right, so just explain the last line. Newton meters and Metcalf.
Well, thank you. So in my slides, there are these hidden jokes, just to be sure that you're paying attention. So in the energy field, there is a unit called the watt, generally abbreviated W, and it's the Newton meter per second. But when Dave Boggs and I wrote the Ethernet paper in 1976, we came across another unit, the bit meter per second, which we took to be an important networking. And so I am lobbying to have that unit named after me. And then it would be abbreviated me. That's what that's about. So, you have all heard the expression, those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it. Have you heard that? Everyone's heard that. So, there's a problem with it because the internet history, as far as I can say, went pretty well. So, therefore, we should ignore it and be doomed to repeat it, which would be a good thing. So, there's something wrong with that. So, I went on the internet and Googled up this. And this is the guy, Harvard philosopher, who actually said this some years ago. But he didn't say exactly this. He said a variation of that thing. But this is what he said about history as opposed to the past. He said history is a pack of lies about events that happened, never happened, by people who were not there. So that's an important proviso in any study of history. But I have one defense. I was there. Unlike this warning from Professor Santayana. So I did some more Googling and I accidentally mistyped and I found George Santana, Carlos Santana, but he also said something relevant to this, the conduct of energy, which I quote for your enjoyment. It's time to change your evil ways, baby. Now my wife's a PhD in history. And she has taught me that historians have these eras that they study, and they put a lot of energy into defining the beginnings of the endings of the era so they can do their dissertations on this particular topic and so on. So when did the internet era start? Most of you believe it started in 1998 with the founding of Google, but that's too recent. Some people think the internet was invented in 1991 by Al Gore, who there was a bill called the Gore Bill in which he initiated the creation of the internet, unquote. It was ironically signed into law by George Bush. But it seems a little too recent, doesn't it? So you can go back, as you see on the chart, to the invention of the World Wide Web or the installation of the TCP. 1973 was a big year. TCP/IP was invented here at Stanford in a seminar series held by Vint Cerf, which I was a part of. And that's why I think my name is on that damn plaque.
I can go check.
Let's check on that later. Yeah. But Bo Breidenbach and Newman thinks the internet goes back further than that, so they celebrated the birthday of the internet on the occasion of 1969, which was that's when UCLA also celebrated it, because that's when the first packet switches went in. Or you could go back to the invention of packet switching by Davies et al. In 1960, Davies and Barron, Paul Barron, around here. Or you could go back to Sputnik, which was the provocation that caused the US Department of Defense to start investing in these technologies that led to the internet. Or you could, as I want to do, is go back to 1946, 47, the invention of the transistor, because clearly the transistor was a driving part of this internet thing. The other thing I like about 1946 is that I was born in 1946. So the internet and I and the transistor are all about the same age. And you getting the theme here now? It's the key point here, no matter, hardly doesn't matter which one of these events you choose to mark the beginning of the internet era, is that the internet era is not a 1 or 2, 3, 4, 5 year thing. It's a decades long thing by almost any of these measures. So I take 63 years as the age of the internet. Let's not argue about that, but it's a long time. And if you take a 63-year or a 50-year time frame, then that's a different mentality than thinking that you're going to solve energy in the next few years with a Manhattan Project, which is a different mindset, and I claim, based on internet history, is the wrong mindset. So one of the things that happens when you have 50 or 60 years is a phenomenon called hardening of the categories, where you begin to think you understand the world and you start to taxonomize and categorize it, and then as the years march on, those categories are proven to be completely misleading, false trichotomies, for example. So in my experience, the beginning of the internet, the telephone network was provided by AT&T, and that included the telephones on your wall or on your table. And the wires was all one thing. So the difference between the telephone network and the so-called customer premises equipment, that distinction did not exist, but came in approximately 1968 with the Carter phone decision of the FCC. We began to have a difference between the network and the attached equipment. Local and long distance were all provided by AT&T, but that broke apart with MCI and others, so that, of course, now Skype seems to be smurging them together again, but the categories are fluid. Computers and communication. Computers were done by IBM, and they were regulated by the Antitrust Division of the US Department of Justice. And communications was done by AT&T, that was regulated by the FCC. So the FCC actually held inquiries, the computer inquiry, whose purpose was to decide what was computing, because that was Justice's job, and what was communication, because that was the FCC's job. So those two categories got smurged, because packet switches are computers, communicating computers, and computers started, spending all their time communicating. That is a false dichotomy. Another one is voice, video, and data. You've all heard that expression, probably, voice, video, and data. Well, there was a time when voice, video, and data were entirely separate things. Voice was telephone, video was television, and data was the Model 33 teletype. This was the principal communication means on the internet in 1969. And you'll notice this phone is old enough, it doesn't even have a dial on it. I don't think I'm that old. That is HD snow. And most people have never seen snow. But if you're my age, snow is a fairly common thing to see. And then there's the teletype. Well, today, those three categories have submerged. And we have now on our desktop video conferencing with voice and video and data all in the same, all on IP packets. These have converged. That was a false trichotomy. Voice is no longer just telephony. Video is no longer just television. And data is, Well, they're all data now. So going to energy, we have a false trichotomy. Just by a tiny example, we have just suffered from a false trichotomy. How many of you are in favor of biofuels like corn ethanol? I see a show of hands of all the... So I've given this, I've asked this question in front of large groups now 30, 40 times. No one ever raises their hand. Somebody voted for corn ethanol. So I've been told to go to Iowa. But, you know, in the U.S. Senate and Congress, the people from Iowa don't get to decide. The whole thing votes. So all those people... What's that?
Are you trying to get killed?
Well, I'm just getting started. So they thought that there's these three categories: feed for animals, food for people, and fuel for our machines. And they said, because we want to be green, we should pass all sorts of laws regulating the price and supply of this biofuel, namely corn ethanol. And what they overlooked is that this is a false trichotomy. Corn can be used as a feed, as a food, and a fuel. And when you muck with this market, you screw up these markets. And so we have a mess and a backlash. And now I can't find anybody who likes corn ethanol. Just a small example of this categorization problem. So in the next 50, 63 years, whatever taxonomy, you should be prepared that whatever taxonomies and trichotomies that you might have, they're going to change over time, because that's what happened in the internet. And this is only a small example. So the internet, by the way, the internet did not go away on March 10th, 2001 when the internet bubble burst. It's still here, and it was growing steadily through that period, and it's still here. And one of the things we did with the internet over the years is we used the internet to build the internet. So now maybe we can use the internet to build what I'm vaguely calling the internet. And here are some ways. The internet has developed now as a really powerful tool of collective intelligence. So we collaborate through the internet in ways that were not possible in 1972 or 69. So we can use collective intelligence enhanced by the internet to solve energy. That's some good news. We can use the internet to save energy through massive substitutions of communication for transportation. So instead of all of us lugging our atoms here, and I guess all of us didn't, I guess half of us did, and the other half are out there, we lugged our bits here instead of our atoms. And so through massive substitutions we can save energy, and that's a partial solution to the energy problem. And I'll return to that point. But we can also use the internet to build the internet. So I will argue later that the internet itself will be the control plane for the smart grid, or some version of that. And then I'll even argue later that the internet's architecture might be applied to the power portion of the smart grid. And then I'll argue also, to really upset people, that the innovation infrastructure that was developed and used to build the internet can be applied to energy. And by that I'm referring to universities and venture capitalists and startups and all of that. The innovation infrastructure of the internet can be applied to energy. The internet, for example, I think will have great impact on the car, the automobile. And here are two. There's mobility on demand. This is a system in which you don't own a car. You just order up the car you need when you need it. And you don't even drive the car. It drives itself. And so I predict, I think, looking at history, that in my lifetime we will, as a general matter, not own cars, and we won't even drive cars, which means 1 million lives will be saved. No more automobile accidents. No more trips to the DMV. There's a benefit. So the internet will impact this part of energy, I'm pretty sure. I have a hunch. This is highly arguable. There are people who refuse to agree. There are people who think that everyone will always want to drive cars because it's in our DNA. Those are the same people who argue that PCs will never take off because important executives will never want to sit at a keyboard and type all day. This was a heavy argument in the early 80s. Only secretaries will use PCs because they type on typewriters, but important people will never use PCs. Important people will never allow a car to be driven by a robot. They'll want to have their hands on the wheel. Hey, you guys do user interface design here? What do you think of a user interface of a device that all you have to do is go like this, and you kill your whole family. What kind of user interface is that? So it'll be gone in my lifetime. Now you have seen this slide many times, right? That's a picture, several pictures of Earth stitched together to show you what Earth looks like at night. And the people showing you this picture, at least the ones I've seen, want you to feel bad. They want you to, as an American, if you are, they want you to feel terrible that all that light is leaking out of the United States of America, where there are other places on Earth, which like South America, Africa, China, which are dark. And the implicit argument they're making is that it would be a better place if the entire world were dark. Well, I don't agree with that. And the internet history does not agree with that. So in the beginning of the internet, there was a thing called the internet, the information explosion, written about widely. And there was an infrastructure installed by the AT&T company over 100 years with billions of dollars invested in it. So it was like a flywheel constant of the universe known as the telecom network. And with the information explosion coming, what hope had we to carry all that information? We had to go for the low-hanging fruit and conserve and be efficient with energy. So we invented multi-access computer networks and packet switching and compression algorithms, all aimed at conserving and being more efficient with bandwidth. Does anyone remember that? Ethernet was a sharing of a coax. Buffered terminals only had to communicate intermittently. We were conserving and being efficient. And the token ring. Where are you from? Are you from IBM? He still works there. How many token rings do you still have at IBM? But here's the question. Having started here, excuse me? You ripped all the token rings out? Thank you. So here's the question. So we built the internet now. And we've done all this, conservation and efficiency. Do we use less bandwidth now than we did before the construction of the internet? Do we use like 20% more? No. Do we use like 2 times more? Do we use like 1,000,000 times more? That's closer. I don't know the actual number. Let's say a round number. We are now using 1,000,000 times more bandwidth than before we built the internet, even though we started here. Yes, sir?
Google's daily swing, according to the chart during the outage, is about 15 gigabits per second in the afternoon when people start getting on, down to about 6 gigabits per second in the early morning. Just for Google.
And the first instantiation of the internet had transcontinental links that ran at 50 kilobits per second. So if the internet is any guide, when we're done solving energy, we're not going to be using less energy, if the internet is any guide, and that's arguable, by the way. I'm arguing that we are going to, instead of conservation's a non-starter, by the way. No one wants to conserve. Efficiency, okay. But we're not going to give up anything. We're willing to do it more efficiently, but we're not going to wear sweaters in our 50-degree houses to say, and the Indians and the Chinese are certainly not going to do that. So this is a good place to start, and I rush to my own defense. This is my new car. So I traded in my 12-cylinder Mercedes for a 3-cylinder Mercedes. That is not my wife. My wife is better looking than she is. And this car is a smart car. It's in Massachusetts, so you can see what my license plate is, a SMAT car. So I'm not saying conservation and efficiency are a bad thing in case someone wants to pick a fight like you. He has a smart car also. I can tell from his key. Good move. But they still only get about 35, 38 miles per gallon.
They were just talking Musk and the electric ones. I actually saw my first electric one last week.
So I want one of those.
Talk to Elon.
Okay. What was the point I was going to make?
Using more smart cards.
Efficiency.
Efficiency is good, but you're going to use a lot anyway.
We're going to use a lot anyway, and our goal should not be to make the world dark. Our goal should be to light that thing up everywhere. And by the way, the amount of energy leaking, those are very sensitive satellite cameras. You don't need much energy to light up Earth, I can assure you. Our goal should be to lighten the world, not darken it. And so when anyone puts that up, you shouldn't buy that you're a bad person because your country has electricity. Now, one of the lessons of the internet, now this is, speaking of China and India, I think this is the elephant thing, and I think 6 Indian guys, in this case, this is the Chinese version, so they have 8 Chinese guys touching this elephant, and they all have a different conception of what it is. And this is crystal clear in the internet. I mean, we started with this conservation, compression, convergence thing, and some of us thought it was a computing thing. ARPA didn't have to buy another computer center. They just had to put you on the internet so you could access it. And some people thought it was a commerce thing. It's now very much a commerce thing. Then there was the content phase we went through where we didn't do commerce yet. We hadn't thought of advertising. So the notion of the internet evolved over time, and we can expect the same evolution to occur in energy. And one recollection I have clearly from the 1970s is that we were not building the internet in order to support YouTube. In fact, our vision was to carry a 7-bit ASCII character across the United States and back to Echoplex on the ASR-33 in under a half a second. That was our goal, not YouTube. And now most of the internet is YouTube or various things related to video and YouTube. What's that?
Spam.
There's spam too. But that leads to the energy question. If we're going to use a million times more energy than we do today, what are we going to use it for? So I've begun trying to build a library of answers to that question. I'm not done, but I have a few. So what are energy's YouTubes? So one of them is just general prosperity and freedom, whichever order you put those in. That is, we have an economic system, which I understand from a previous speaker is broken. But energy is a factor of production. It appears in many places in the huge economy. So what if you just took the cost of energy down a factor of 10? Clean energy. I hasten that it needs to be clean. I'm not begging that question. But what if you lowered its cost by a factor of 10? Well, I haven't done the math yet. I'm looking for an economist who can help me answer the question. If you took energy over the next 50 years down in cost, factor of 10, how much prosperity would you get just from that? And I want to do that math. You know the answer?
Dr. Bob Ayers? Did you see it?
No.
That's what he does.
I'll
Talk
ask
to you later.
Thank you. So that could be used for a lot of energy just because there is a famous economist who has a paradox. His name is Jevons. And in 1865, he noticed that if you reduce the cost of energy, in his case it was coal, the usage did not go down. You reduce the cost of energy and the use goes up. And we've observed that recently in mileage on automobiles. We've improved the mileage of automobiles, but people just drive more now and they use bigger cars and so on. So a lot of energy could, and I want to do the math and I want to have the answer. I've done some math for the other examples. Another one is space travel. So this is my friend Charles Simonyi, who wrote Microsoft Word, and as a consequence, from Xerox PARC. He's a billionaire. This slide is out of date. He's now been to the International Space Station twice. The first time he paid $25 or $30 million to go. This time he paid 30 or 35 million. So it's not what we would call mainstream thing. But he was taken there under the auspices of an organization called Space Adventures in somewhere near Vienna, Virginia. So I went there and I visited the CEO and I got him to do a back-of-the-envelope calculation. Let's say there were 10 billion people in 2070, and let's say 5% of them go to space every year, and we'll give them a choice. They can go to the moon and back, or they can just go to Mars. it's about the same in energy. So we did the multiplication. I have it written down here. And so it's about 500 exajoules per year, which is, by coincidence, and this is an envelope calculation, about the same amount of energy that the human race uses today, every year, 500 exajoules. So there's a great application for all this energy we're going to generate, is just going into outer space. And in 70 years, so when you mention going to outer space, you sort of are playing with kook territory. But we're talking about 63 years here. And, you know, we're going to be going out. Charles is doing it today. Now, admittedly, at $30 million a pop, but it's going to come down. God bless him. Well, how about another one? I hear there's a problem with water. We just don't have enough water. There's millions of people dying every year because they don't have clean, fresh water. So what if we solve that problem? Let's assume 10 billion people, and let's give them all 400 liters a day, which is the current American standard. Let's not ask anyone to sacrifice. Let's ask them to be just like us and get 400 liters per day. You do the math. It turns out to require, oh, by the way I'm doing this is I'm boiling the water all the way. Getting the salt out, getting all the bugs out, and making fresh, clean water, the brute force way. So there are obviously better ways to do this. But it turns out to be 7.6 times 500 exajoules. So now we're getting into multiples of the current energy usage. And then, for those of you who are worried about global warming, and I understand some of you are, why don't we take this abundant, cheap and clean energy, squanderably abundant, cheap and clean energy, and use it to take the CO2 out of the atmosphere? And the current estimate that I've got from the University of Calgary is what's the number? I have it written down here. Oh, yes. He estimates it'll take 100 kilowatt hours per ton to scrub atmospheric 385 parts per million CO2 out of the atmosphere with a device looking something like this, which, by the way, takes, of course, when you burn coal, you produce CO2, and you get the electricity. Then you take the electricity and you put it into this device, and then it scrubs that CO2 out of the atmosphere, and there's a 10x improvement. So under his estimate, which I'm not in a position to verify at this time, but if you assume it's 100 kilowatt hours per ton, you end up improving coal by a factor of 10. That is, you take 10 times more out for the same electricity. Well, this turns out to be a mere 10.8 exajoules per year, if my math is correct. And incidentally, all these slides are available on a PowerPoint online. Where at Stanford?
With the abstract. The PDF you sent is there, and you can download it.
So if someone would like to get the PDF and go to this slide, yes?
Bob, so are you saying that if you burn 1 ton of coal, you release X amount of CO2, and if you turn that electricity back, you can remove the 10X?
Only approximately. You burn some coal, which makes electricity and CO2, and then you use 1/10 of the electricity to take that CO2 out of the atmosphere. But once again, I urge that you, those of you who are really interested in this, you can have my slides and check my math and Google this guy up. But I'm claiming that
by about a factor of...
What's that?
The current estimates on the energy burden to do carbon sequestration for coal plants are much, much bigger than that. So his numbers are way low than anybody else's numbers.
Well, thank you.
Which are typically between 40 and 50% of the energy output. So I don't know where he gets his numbers from, but he's way off the mean of what people who talk about.
And he may be even further way off, because he's not talking about scrubbing the flue gases. He's talking about scrubbing atmospheric CO2, which is even harder. So we should be suspicious of these numbers, but the point is I'm making this list of ways we're going to use this squanderable amount of energy, and since global warming seems to be of such great interest to all of you, well, we could just scrub the atmosphere directly with all this abundant energy that we're going to make somehow. So I'm going to be building this library over time and invite you to join me. And so what are energies, YouTubes? I'm building a list. You've seen the first few entries on the list. So now that I mentioned global warming, I remember when the internet many times was a movement. You know what I mean by movement? Beliefs, dogma, heroes, slogans, vituperation. You remember during the bubble in 2000, the 7 most feared words on the internet? You just don't get it, do you? That kind of movement, you know. Well, it's akin to a paradigm, but it's nastier than that. So, and global warming, I claim, is a movement. And it bears many of the it has many of the features of the internet movement. Now, this was Vint Cerf, the actual inventor of the internet. He still, to this day, walks around saying, I pee on everything. And he would be the, either the prophet or the god himself, we're not sure, of the internet movement. And then I know that many movements have colors. You know, feminism is purple, Islam is green, communism is red, the United States of America is red, white, and blue, and there are many, many examples. So I was trying to think what the color of the internet movement was, and well, that's the color of the Ethernet movement, was yellow. That I can attest to. But of the internet, I'm not sure, but I'm thinking transparent may have been the color of the internet. So, energy. Does anyone know, like offhand, what the color is of the energy movement? Is it ever come up? Anyone want to guess what the color of the energy movement is?
I call it green, don't they?
Green?
Blue comes up a lot.
Oil, black.
I'm sorry, you guys don't watch enough television. Green is the color of the energy movement. Companies greenwash. Tom Friedman of the New York Times first asked this question, so now I'm asking it, because is green really the right color for our movement here, saying we're going to solve energy? Should we have chosen green as the color? And Friedman argued briefly, and I will argue at length, that green is not a really good choice. Of course, it stands for environmentalism, and it always has, but it also stands for, well, these people show up, violent demonstrations against trade, capitalism, America, technology, nuclear. They are against everything we need to solve energy. So green is not the color. What better color? Well, someone suggested black. I'd like to point out the silicon is not actually black. That's the plastic that's black. The silicon is mirror-like. Anyway, it's depressing. It's not a color. White. The Earth could be whiter. If the Earth were just a little bit whiter, we wouldn't have a global warming problem. We just need to nudge the albedo, not albedo, there I go. Oh yeah. Oh, it's libido that I almost said, yeah. So let's look at the visible spectrum, and what do we notice about the visible spectrum? We notice that plants, through the process of photosynthesis, absorb mostly blue and red. Even plants don't like green. So the better color, and it's already been hinted at, is suggested by this famous NASA photograph of the blue marble. Earth is 71% water. The average depth of the ocean is 12,000 feet. The number of species in the ocean is like 90-some% of all species on Earth. If we're going to find solutions to energy, there's a really good chance it's going to have something to do with the ocean, which is generally said to be the deep blue sea. So we need to learn to explore it. And Ron, you'll recognize this submarine that you and I learned to fly. And we have a lot of exploring to do in the oceans. And of course there's the sky, which is where, right now, as you well know, the solar energy impinging at 1366 watts per square meter is about 10,000 times the amount of energy that we use today. So maybe a lot of energy is going to come from the sky, which is generally called the blue sky. So I'm arguing that blue should be the color of the energy movement. Now, I'm not getting a lot of traction with this idea, but you heard it here first. Is this a blue state? Well, see, that was another clever thing. The guy who just passed away, he was, no, the TV guy, Tim Russert. It was Tim Russert who assigned those colors to the states. So imagine this. He's sitting there, he's got red and blue, red and blue. Now red, that's like communism's color. And the Democrats are closer to being communists than everybody else, so we should call them, no, 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 no. Let's give red to the Republicans, and let's take blue, which he did, and the Democrats won with blue, so that's one reason I'm choosing blue, is to go with a winning color. The bigger point, I think, a big point, and I was reminded of this when I walked by the Y2E2 building, which is not unusual. Every university, I visit a lot of universities. I love universities. They're all creating departments and buildings of energy and the environment. Energy and the environment, like that's the same topic. Now, it has become the same because of the global warming bubble, where thanks to CO2, energy and the environment are linked. But energy and the environment are not the same thing. For example, you could solve energy and you'd still have a climate change problem. The climate is changing whether we have CO2 or not. And you could solve, say by scrubbing the CO2 atmosphere, you could solve the climate change problem, but we still need energy, gobs of it. So they're not the same topic. So I'm arguing, all right, let the environmental people, they can have green, but for energy, I want blue. So, yes?
You were when you compared ocean to land, that's just surface. If you actually do volume, then there's more brown.
This is a digression, but if you were to look at the biosphere,
Yeah, but
okay.
why restrict ourselves to the biosphere?
We're trying to save the biosphere, not the earthosphere. Anyway, that's a good point. I had never considered that brown might be a better color. Returning to internet history.
Oh, and your name is out there, but it's in a corner.
My name is on the plaque like I
You're on the
thought.
plaque, but it's surrounded by a bunch of people nobody ever heard of.
Like,
You know, the bottom of the credits. You're next to the caterer.
I flew all the way from Boston to come to that event so I get my name on the plaque, and I'm happy to hear that it's even next to the caterer. Are we done with that digression? Yeah. So returning to the internet and the history of the internet, there's a lesson that I would call expect surprises. There were lots of surprises, and this is one of the most embarrassing surprises to me. In the left here, you see the packet switch that was the early internet. It's called an IMP, and Stanford had one, and MIT had one, and Xerox had one. And the man standing there is Frank Hart. He actually built the internet at BBN, and he's standing there fiddling with the switches as I did for many years. And we, as ARPA contractors, were obligated to go to the attached ASR 33 every month and ask for the printout of a table, which was the packet counts. So say at MIT, where I did this, it would say MIT to Harvard, 9,780,000 packets. And then it would say MIT to Stanford, and MIT to UCLA, and I would then send this into ARPA. The bottom was a really embarrassing entry in the table. It was MIT packets going to MIT. And it was the biggest number by far. And the ARPANET was not built to connect MIT to MIT, so this was viewed as embarrassing. In fact, we referred to it as incestuous traffic. And we didn't report it to ARPA because it's obviously not what ARPA was interested in. And only a few years later, I found myself with Ron and Dave and others involved in doing Ethernet, and now all traffic on the internet, percentage-wise, is incestuous. That is, land traffic is really heavy. I didn't recognize land traffic when I saw it. I viewed it as incestuous traffic, and only a few years later, like 3 or 4, suddenly I was in the incestuous traffic business, and what a big surprise that was. There were many of them in the internet. Here's some surprises. Upper left, it's called a Hollerith card or an IBM card, 80 columns. You have to be old to have used it. I still have some of these in my desk. They make great to-do list cards because they stick out of your pocket a little. So that's why they're really good. Now, yes? So I refer to that as cellulosic computing. But then we got, and when the internet was being built originally, that was the dominant mode. Batch processing of cards was the dominant mode, even here at Stanford. And then came this interactive time-sharing mode. Big surprise, glass teletypes, even had color. And in that model, we were building ever larger computers using Grosch's law as our guide, and then connecting ever larger numbers to these centralized computing utilities where we would use time-sharing, interactive time-sharing, to build our computers. And we were confused there because we thought that time-sharing was the important part. Actually, it was the interaction that was the important part. So then we went to personal computers where we stopped time-sharing. Sort of Bill Gates sort of uninvented time-sharing, and Steve Jobs before him, to come up with personal computers. And now we're being surprised by the evolutions to these platforms. So there's surprise after surprise after surprise. And here's another, this is one of my favorite surprises. In the early days of the internet, we thought that local traffic would be carried by the copper installed by AT&T, and long haul would go by microwave or even satellite, which is a form of microwave. Well, that's completely wrong. The long haul stuff now is all carried by optical fibers buried in the earth, wires, and the local is all Wi-Fi or cellular. So we were off completely 180 degrees. Big surprise. There'll be more of them. Here's 3 big surprises the internet had. Now these are surprises we should not recapitulate in energy. Because the internet was built by grad students, we didn't put any security in it because all grad students are honest and we're all part of a community, and so we don't need security. And I wrote RFC, RFC 89, I think it was called. Oh, very early one, either 602 or 89, warning about this. The name of that RFC was called "The Stockings Were Hung by the Chimney with Care." And it was about some high school students who wreaked some havoc on the internet. And of course, since we were grad students and we thought everything was free, we didn't put any economics in the internet, so we should be sure not to make that mistake in energy. It used to be venture capital that funded the internet, and now it's advertising. Eventually, we'll have real economics on the internet.
I'm sorry, you say that doesn't work? That the internet has failed because of this error?
No, it's been a painful process to watch the internet recover from the early mistake that we didn't put economics in there.
If we had put economics in at the start, it would have been like AT&T.
I've heard that argument. So let's, I've heard that argument. It's a respectable one. We don't have time for it today. And then there was quality of service. As I said, we were trying to carry ASCII characters, and we forgot, so we used things called best efforts communications, and we didn't reserve bandwidth, and that's not really working anymore, so we're having to fix that. By the way, all of these could be mistakes we can make in energy. We can make the same mistakes. Well, we don't have to because we have the benefit of this history, so we want to be careful that our energy networks are secure and that there's economics involved and that the quality of service, like 24/7 would be nice.
To do this to you again, except I don't. You could do the same mistake of planning the quality of service and have made the mistake of planning the wrong quality of service. The current uses of the net shouldn't be supportable, and yet they tend to be. So we need to go back and make it better, but if we had planned beforehand, we would have planned wrong.
I'm very familiar with those arguments. I admire them greatly. But I don't think we should use them as an excuse for not thinking about this and trying to do the best we can with the benefit of hindsight. And I really like the earlier argument which you made, which is in the early stages of some project, it may be acceptable and desirable to operate in one mode, and then when you get downstream, you have to switch modes, like shifting gears in a car, and that's another argument. So maybe we started in exactly the right place, but maybe we didn't. Here's another surprise. This is the internet bubble was a surprise, and this is a plot of, I don't know, stock prices associated with internet stock. And on March 10th, 2000, I think it was, the bubble burst. So there was a bubble, and it burst. It was horrible. And I'm really grateful for the mortgage bubble, because now they don't talk about this bubble anymore. Now, global warming is a bubble. How, I've asserted, how do I know that global warming is a bubble? Al Gore. Al Gore and I inflated the internet bubble arm in arm. He's back. And it could be that the global warming bubble is already bursting for the various reasons. Now, during the internet bubble, you all realize the internet was growing. So when I say global warming is a bubble, I am not saying the Earth is getting colder. I'm completely finessing that issue. There is a bubble. You can tell it from the behavior of the media, of everyone. They call them, the people who disagree with consensus science. So there's a word, a loaded word. The people who disagree with the consensus are called deniers. That is really nasty rhetoric, equating such people with Holocaust deniers. There's a bubble. You need to be careful because it may have already burst. Now, the solar had a bubble and it bursts, and it'll have another 10 bubbles before it's done. And biofuels has certainly had the ethanol bubble, and now we're going through the cellulosic bubble, and then I think there'll be an algae. There's already been an algae bubble, and there'll be another one. And so, despite the fact that in support of the fact that global warming is a bubble, I think bubbles are good. That is, in the general notion of technological innovation, when you're going against the entrenched status quo, like the IBM Corporation's token ring, for example, you find that the status quo is extremely nasty and resourceful, and you need every tool you can get to do technological innovation. And one of the many tools is speculative bubbles. So they're a good thing, and the impulse when a bubble bursts, as you've just seen with the mortgage bubble, is to run to Washington and make them illegal. And I'm claiming that that's counterproductive. So you should not try to outlaw the bubbles, just be sure you have a chair when the music stops if you want to mix metaphors. Incidentally, this is a picture of me on the summit of Mount Kilimanjaro, 19,341 feet. This is the crater. Those are our tents, our expedition tents, are those little orange things there, and that's the remnants of the crater. And here I am standing right next to the remnants of the, did I say remnants of the crater? Remnants of the glacier. So here I am standing by the glacier, and this is a puddle. It is melting. Now this is equatorial Africa, and this ice is only 11,000 years old. The mountain is 100,000 years old. The ice is 11,000 years old, but it is melting. So there's some heating going on. So when I say global warming is a bubble, I'm not denying that there's warming going on. I'm just warning you against getting all excited, overexcited by Al Gore and his ilk. Now in the internet, we had, moving on and returning to history, we had laws. The first law that I remember was called Grosch's Law. Herb Grosch, an IBM executive, had this beautiful data that showed, like this, that the cost of a computer went up as the square root of its computational power. And he had mainframes going back to the Jacquard loom right up to the 360. Boom, 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 boom. And wouldn't you know that square root curve was a perfect fit, and we had Grosch's Law. This law explains why Silicon Valley took over for Route 128. Because Route 1, whoever said who said Thank you. They don't like, I'm in Route 128 now, they don't like hearing this, but Route 128 got all hooked up in mainframes and mini computers in Grosch's Law, and we started doing a thing called multics. And then over here in Silicon Valley, people said, no, Moore's Law is a better law. Smaller computers are better, not bigger. So we continued, where I now live, we continued doing computer utilities based on the multics model, roughly speaking, and off went Silicon Valley on this Moore's Law thing. So laws. And you're all acquainted with Moore's Law, right? And then there was Metcalfe's Law. Metcalfe's Law and Moore's Law have something in common. They both begin with M. I only mention it. These laws are, I claim, these laws, particularly Moore's law, which is the best of them all, you realize they're not laws of physics or thermodynamics or anything. They're agendas, they're plans, they're directional. I remember working for decades, many of us worked for decades trying to make Gordon right every year. And we're still doing it. And I just came from Intel Research up the valley, and they're still working on making Gordon right, and it's a good and great goal. Well, the internet needs laws. We need some laws for energy, and we should start working on them. I don't have a very good one. Now, this is a Berkeley guy, and he doesn't know I'm doing this, but I found this chart he did, which showed look at all those dots, particularly those, and how well they fit this particular line, which shows the declining cost of solar energy. So one could imagine that there's a law about that. And at the moment I'm calling it Nemet's law because he did this data for me. Well, he didn't know he was doing it for me, but I stole it from him. But this is a good kind of law that we need for energy, for projecting the cost of energy or the efficacy of solar and so on. So let's all start working on what the laws should be for energy. Now, I mentioned going to Washington to make bubbles illegal. In the internet, watching what happened when people went to Washington, I've concluded that Washington, D.C. is a pro-am, and we are the AMs. So whenever we go to Washington to get stuff, in my experience, we often get the wrong stuff. Now, I mentioned corn ethanol. That's the wrong stuff. Someone went to Washington, got the wrong stuff. Actually, my favorite example of the wrong stuff is the Department of Energy. It was founded in the 1970s by Jimmy Carter for the purpose of reducing our dependence on foreign oil. 30 years have passed. DOE's budget is approaching $25 billion a year. How are we doing on our dependence on foreign oil? We are getting the wrong stuff. And we got another piece of wrong stuff from the DOE. We didn't get any nuclear energy. It's true we have 104 nuclear power plants. They produce 20% of our electricity reliably, inexpensively. But we haven't built a new power plant, a nuclear power plant, in 30 years, thanks to the Department of Energy or whoever else I'm supposed to thank. And this is the wrong stuff. We need energy. We need nuclear. And I guess what I can report is we have some good news. Nuclear is coming back. I've seen 5 fission startups, and I've seen 1, 2 fusion startups even. So as an investor, I went to the fusion lab at MIT, and I walked by our fission reactor there, and I walked in, and I said, hey, I just passed your fission reactor. And he says, no, that's not our reactor. That's a fission reactor, Bob. This is the fusion lab. Fission is easy. What we do here is much harder than that. So I'm trying not to use the word nuclear anymore. It's fission and fusion, as on the solar, wind, fission, fusion. That's the list of energy. And nuclear appears to be coming back. This, by the way, is a picture of what goes on in the nuclear reactor. What color is that? Clearly blue. Now, I have passingly disparaged Washington, but I would like to point out that Washington, D.C. actually did some good things in the history of the internet reveals. So, for example, in the early 1980s, a dramatic reduction was legislated in capital gains taxes, which led to a blossoming of venture capital, which led to every company you've ever heard of in the Valley, including Intel, Apple, Cisco, 3Com. All of them came out of this one rule which reduced the cost of capital gains taxes. The government also demonopolized AT&T and IBM. So beginning with the Carter phone decision in '68, which said you could hook non-Bell Labs stuff to the network, to the gutting of the partial gutting of the Bell system in 1984 that turned one huge ponderous monopoly into 7 huge ponderous monopolies. And then there was the reining in of IBM by the Justice Department over a period of 20 years that allowed companies like Intel, Microsoft, and so on to flourish rather than be stifled by the entrenched status quo. The government also served as a lead customer. The Defense Communications Agency bought a flock of those early packet switches and sort of jump-started the whole packet switching market. And the government also has served important roles as a standards maker. Although I would like to point out that TCP/IP wasn't the only standard made by the US government. There was the ISO standards, which came out of Commerce. So for some years, we had that fight between the Commerce standards and the DoD standards, and you know who won that one. But anyway, the government made a net contribution there by stimulating that standards development. But most of all, what government has done really well in the history of the internet, and which we can expect for it to do well in the history of the internet, is research. That is, in reflecting on what happened in the internet, you could see a lot of research came to fruition. It was government sponsored. It was a good thing, so we should have more of that. Now, I'd like to digress briefly as to where we should do that research, because I think I've learned some things about that. Companies. Should we ask companies to do research? In my experience of the internet, the only companies that could afford research are monopolies. AT&T, Bell Labs, IBM, Watson, Xerox copier monopoly, PARC. And monopolies are bad for two reasons. They overtax their customers, overcharge their customers, and two is, the more important one, is they are the status quo, and they are the least motivated players to bring innovations to market. So doing innovation at a monopoly-sponsored research center is not optimal, suboptimal. So where else could we do it? I know, government laboratories, like the many of the Department of Energy. In my experience, those labs are jobs programs. They each have a senator and a bunch of congressmen attached, and they have their budgets, and they go up all the time. And how much science comes out? Some, like some came out of Bell Labs. So we'll say Bell Labs did the transistor, Unix, and the Princess telephone. So we'll give them that much credit. And the national labs occasionally come up with something too, like the World Wide Web. But in my experience, as a general rule, it's a suboptimal investment. So where should the government sponsor research in energy? Where should it be? This is my favorite research university. There are 10 major research universities in the Boston area alone. There are some of them around here, I'm told. Research universities are where research is best done. And I'm not saying that because I think universities are well managed. You had a question?
What about companies funding research? Why go to the government? Companies that are rich, that have money, can fund universities.
Yeah, but I already said that the only companies that can afford research are monopolies. And we shouldn't put up with monopolies.
Not to do it themselves, but to do external funding. For companies to fund universities. I mean, it happens a lot.
I think it's a dead end. There are exceptions. In fact, these are broad generalizations I'm peddling here, so there are exceptions everywhere. But as a general matter, I think we should just bite the bullet and go to the biggest monopoly of them all and have them just tax us and give the money shrewdly to good investments. And the good investments I'm claiming are found at research universities, especially Stanford University or MIT. I should substitute a different picture on this slide. And universities, as I said, are not good because they're well managed. They're really badly managed, and we should fix that. This is my torch at MIT. Like, I'd like to eliminate tenure, for example, which is really a horrible idea. But then there's the real good reason, and that's because universities are in the business of graduating students. And people are the best vehicles for innovation. So you don't develop patents and throw them over the wall. You develop students and you graduate them and send them out into the world. That's why the best place to do research is research universities, not government laboratories and not, I argue, monopolies, which we should stop trying to convince. And I'm talking about research now, not development, but pure stuff. And what we should expect from those universities is silver bullets. There will be silver bullets. It is I've been to so many energy talks where the wizened energy expert says, and there are no silver bullets. Well, I'm sorry. I'd like you to spend less time telling me that there are no silver bullets and more time finding the goddamn silver bullets. Because in internet history, there were lots of silver bullets. Let's call them silver buckshot, if you will. The punch card was a silver bullet. The transistor was a silver bullet. The integrated circuit was a silver bullet. Even time sharing was a silver bullet. the bitmap display, TCP/IP, Ethernet, the World Wide Web. I think the biggest one of all in the internet is dense wave division multiplexing. Before dense wave division multiplexing, my mom said to me, when you drive up to MIT from New York, when you get there, call and let it ring 3 times and then hang up. I want to know you're safe, and I love you, but not that much. Well, thanks to dense wave division multiplexing, we don't do that anymore. We make calls around the world without even thinking about it, and that's thanks to those Bell Labs people who largely developed dense wave division multiplexing. I even went to their annual conference last year and thanked them on behalf of the entire internet community. Energy is going to have silver bullets. We should expect them. You are going to deliver them. So, and then with those silver bullets, we're going to use the internet's innovation infrastructure. So here is 2 Stanford people. Do you recognize them over there? Are they gods here at Stanford?
Hector. He's
Let's see, that's Sandy and Len. And then there's a scaling entrepreneur who joined that team and then fired them. And then the venture capitalist, Don Valentine. This is a recurring pattern. On the East Coast, we like to celebrate this one, Akamai. Professor, research professor, a couple of his students. By the way, this is Danny, who was killed on 9/11. And this is my partner, George Conrades, who was head of IBM USA, became a venture partner, hooked up with the professor and his postdocs, founded Akamai, and Akamai still is a very successful company. These are 2 of many, many examples of how we're going to solve energy. We're going to solve it with fiercely competing teams of research professors, their students, scaling entrepreneurial teams, and venture capitalists. That's how we're going to solve energy if the internet is any guide. Now here is, and I've got 7 minutes to go. Here's a picture of the energy problem. The details don't matter. It's the complexity that matters. Energy is complicated. They often tell me, the real energy people who would like internet people to go away, they say, you know, Bob, energy has to obey the laws of physics. To which I say, well, so does the internet. What they mean is that there's something big and complicated going on here. So what would be the internet type solution to this massive complexity problem? And it would be to have an architecture. To have an architecture for energy. And what would be some of the aspects of that architecture? Well, one of them is layering. So you all still study the ISO reference model and the 7 layers of... Well, if you're not, you should, because this architectural principle worked. It allowed, for example, specialization. So people like me, we lived down here at levels 1 and 2, lived rich, full lives at level 1 and 2, while Tim Berners-Lee was screwing around up there at level 7. And there were people who have lived their entire life, TCP level 4. So it enabled specialization. It enabled progress to proceed at a natural rate at each of these levels. That is, you could speed things up here without changing this, change this without speeding things up here, change the media without changing the HTML formats. So by creating these layers, you allowed technological progress to go at a natural rate at each level instead of being lockstep to just one level. But here's the coolest thing. By creating these layers, somebody had to design the interfaces between the layers. And that was an opportunity for the art of architectural design. So you always considered the generality of the API and what you wanted to go on up there and what you wanted to go on down there. And so built into this this architectural art, is a generalization platform, 6 of them, which created opportunities for serendipity, the YouTubes of the internet. So for example, this stuff was all invented in 1973. The World Wide Web was invented in 1989. Google was founded in 1998, as I recall. Think of the passage of time and that those interfaces were able to live that long and sustain, and come up with a long list of things that were unanticipated. This is a winning architectural principle. Will the architecture of energy be centralized or distributed? Mainframes to microprocessors, centralized power plants to micro turbines. If the internet is any guide, the correct winning architecture for energy will be distributed. Now, they use the word distributed in a funny way. They say, we're going to generate all the energy in this big centralized power plant, and then we're going to distribute it. That is not what I mean. I'm talking about distributed generation of energy. And if you have that, then the topology is different. Instead of having a star or you begin to have more of a mesh network. It's more symmetrical. It doesn't just distribute one way, it's two ways. And then here's another analogy. The telecommunications network of AT&T prior to the internet was synchronous. There was a TDM hierarchy. In later days, SONET became the plumbing, synchronous optical networking. And in order to get your bits on the network, you had to find your time slot and get into the TDM hierarchy in a synchronized way. Does that sound familiar? Of course, to put power on the grid, you have to get the right frequency and phase to get on that network. So what did we do to the telecom network? We desynchronized it. We took the clock and we put it in every packet. Ethernet has the clock in the packet. There isn't some global clock clicking somewhere. Well, all right, let's do the same thing for the grid. Desynchronize it. What was another feature of the old telecom network? Your bits went in, they went at prop delays through the TDM hierarchy, and they popped out shortly thereafter. There weren't no storage there. And what have we been doing for decades? We've been adding storage to the internet everywhere. We had core memories. All right, so there's storage. There's the storage on punch cards, magnetic tape, then came cores. The IMPs had magnetic cores in them, oddly. But then the Winchester disk came along out of IBM. Even a blind, I'll forget that. And semiconductor memories came. So we've got to storify the grid. Here's the principal storage mechanism of energy in the grid today. When there's excess electricity, water is pumped uphill to this pool, and then when the electricity is needed later, it runs back down through the turbines. This is not a scalable solution to storage. Batteries, these are A123 batteries. The lithium-ion battery is a silver bullet. It enabled cell phones and laptops, but the energy density of lithium-ion batteries is pitiful. So maybe we're going to have to go all the way back to fuels again. You know, gasoline is cool because it's very high energy density, so maybe we're going to have to use fuels. That's hydrogen, by the way. So we're going to have to introduce storage at many points in this grid. Smart grid. We're going to desynchronize it. If the internet is any guide, we will desynchronize it and we will storify it. So we will end up with a network which, this is the picture I came up with when I imagined, if I could make a picture of what it will look like in the future, I came up with this. So here is the fission reactor that we live on, and we harvest its energy through geothermal. And there's the fusion reactor that taunts us every day by flying across the sky going, I can do it and you can't. And it could be that the right answer to this problem is to keep our fusion reactor 93 million miles away and just harvest its energy with solar. That could be the answer. I have a feeling we're going to build our own fusion reactors pretty soon. And we may build our own fission. Then we're going to build this intelligent smart grid to connect it all together. And my computer has just indicated it's exactly 5:30, so I am now done on time. Thank you very much. Or we do Q&A now?
We do Q&A.
We have time for that?
We have time for that. You may not all get them on the tape, but we'll get them here.
My only comment when you showed that Livermore slide, when you were talking about the complexity of energy, was you didn't say that with a good Texas drawl.
Well, I could have. Well, I'm from the South. I was raised on southern Long Island.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that while there's a good humorous aspect of using the analogy of the growth of bandwidth and the use of bandwidth, I think there is an interesting continuation of your talk, which is what fraction of the internet bandwidth has information content. Someone suggested spam, and I think you have to really look at it and saying, well, our model is exponential, unlimited use of energy. If it's based on your internet model, 90-something% of it has no useful work. I mean, energy is the potential to do work. So I think you have to somehow recognize that if you're going to have that capacity, yet so much of it provides no thermodynamically useful purpose, which is really what I think spam or other things that clog up the available capacity of the bandwidth is. It's not really the right model to follow at all.
So there was a time when, it's a good point, and there was a time when I was on a panel in '66, and the argument was over batch processing versus time sharing. And the argument was made that time sharing was wasteful. They didn't use thermodynamics on me, but was wasteful because you're wasting computer cycles. Whereas with interactive, because the user didn't have to think very much and would type in bugs, and the computer would waste a lot of time with them. And not only that, over 15% of the computer cycles would be frittered away on the user interface. Whereas punch cards, you had time to think your algorithms through and punch them in carefully and consider them, and then when it came time to run them on the computer, boom, no waste on the UI, fewer bugs. Great little argument there. So, what percentage of computer cycles today are spent on user interface, and what percentage of them are thermodynamically useless? Like, all of your PCs are now sitting on your desks at 3 gigahertz doing absolutely nothing. So that's true, and and if my merely humorous projection comes true, that'll be true of energy too. So what?
Well, I would say so what? Only if the production of the energy has external costs, then you somehow have to fold that in terms of what are you getting for that cost.
Good point. So
my
assumption.
The difference is in building a fiber optic network with a lot of excess bandwidth is there's an installed cost of putting it in. But then while you have some applications that use that bandwidth, there's an extra cost, so to speak, for the excess capacity to be used to, you know, send pictures of Angelina Jolie or whatever it is that's selling you things that enhance your outlook on life or whatever. That stuff goes for free. But there may actually be costs in strip mining Montana, or there may actually be costs in using water, which is, you mentioned water in your talk. There are actual finite uses and applications of these things that have certain benefits and certain costs. So while I enjoy your talk, and it's a great way to get people to think about it, there are costs with the generation of energy that are not trivial. And so that a model that assumes kind of an exponential increase as its use, and I understand the point you're making about, well, most computing cycles are wasted anyway. I mean, you know, maybe what is the purpose of all this stuff? But I'd like to think that the cost to having your computer on your desk, rotating the corporate logo, or putting up banner ads is pretty benign relative to some of the environmental costs of energy.
So that is a point I just skipped over. So when I say our goal is to provide squanderably abundant, cheap, and clean energy, I buried in the word clean that all the externalities are being considered and not ignored. But I haven't dwelled on that point, which is a fair point. And how we do that has not been worked out. I'm just saying that's, if the internet is any guide, that's where we'll end up. But I don't know how exactly, or even approximately, how we're going to do that. So it's true, if we generated infinite energy and it produced as much CO2 as it does today, and as much excess heat as it does today, and as much strip mining as it does today, then that would not be a good thing. I just didn't touch on that point. So when I said cheap and clean, I was sort of, don't we wave our hands in EE380? I was assuming that cheap meant the externalities were being taken care of, and but I take your point. That's a homework assignment, which is how you take care of those externalities. Yes.
To that point, there's a lot of ways to code that we're not using, which we could use as an energy source. So you could, you know, It would work in that case.
Oh, there's no, well, wasted only in the sense that we don't harness that, H nu of energy to do work, but it does involve the temperature balance of the Earth and all kinds of other things. But I agree with you, the ability to use that energy is barely touched in the way that we as a society do this. There are many opportunities, I agree with you. And I like the whole scaling from the punch card on. I think it's a great way to talk about the transformational aspects of technology towards purposes. So it makes a great path to think with.
And there are, just to return to this point, I mean, when you think in a 63-year time frame, you don't spend your time at what's called the floors, that is, how biofuels compare to gasoline today, because over that period of time you get to look at the ceilings, that is, how far can this technology ever go? And then you look at solar 10,000 times, you look at nuclear 1,000,000 times of energy density, and you say there's a lot of headroom there. So there is a hope of getting getting these externalities handled and getting access to infinite energy, although there's a lot of details to be handled in the meantime. Yes?
I'm interested in the fact that a lot of the surprises that you pointed to on the internet were kind of psychological surprises. Failures to predict what people were going to do. The spam is one case, porn is another case. People were surprised about social networking. They're surprised about lots of things. And so in thinking about your future of very inexpensive energy, I'm wondering what will the psychology of the 12 or 15-year-old be who all of a sudden finds himself with tools and toys that are very powerful, can be driven by energy, could go around and just do a lot of physical stuff. Now, if they send bits over the internet, that's, it doesn't really hurt. You delete it in your mailbox on the internet. But if people broadly have massive amounts of energy that can do good and can do harm, it kind of scales everything up. And so the consequences of people's decisions and who has this power and how it's distributed and so forth is somewhat different. No one's ever been killed by an evil.
I think you are making a different point, unknowingly, that the analogy continues to work. That the analogy between information and energy continues to work. So as you scale up the internet, say take social networking, take the recent Craigslist killer in Boston, you create the capability of doing bad things at the same time. So you have to be careful about that. And the same will happen with energy. It's already happened with nuclear. That little unfortunate left turn there in 1945. So you have to deal with the negative. But is that a reason not to do anything at all? I don't think so. I think you just have to be.
It wasn't actually a thing that was different from your point. I was thinking if I wanted you to worry more about those things. You've got a lot to worry about. Worry a little bit about the psychological consequences also.
So I believe in specialization, and and there's other people. I've delegated the worrying, as you detected with your comment. I've delegated the worrying about a lot to some other people. My job is to be enthusiastic about things. Bruce.
I was at the Computer History Museum a while back with Paul Barron, whom you mentioned earlier. He was extolling the virtues of competition to do many things in the industry, which is, I think, a foundation of your internet future, is get some competition going. And the issue came up of standards versus competition. In the U.S., we have lousy cell service because we have no standards, whereas other parts of the world have a single cell network and they compete on other dimensions. Your ISO model is a standards model. Came in early, helped the process along, but our normal entrepreneurs hate standards. They want to create their own. And 10 standards is better than one. How do you draw that line?
Well, it's situational and it's subtle and complicated. So there's having no standards. There's having, which is horrible in many cases. There's having one standard, which can be horrible if it's the wrong standard.
Yes.
But then there's the normal case where there's usually several standards. And some of them are standards on the way out, and some of them are standards coming in, and some of them are standards that solve a slightly different problem. So there is a variety. Someone famously said standards are so nice because there's so many to choose from. But you can have too many, and you can have too few, and the right answer is in the middle, and it varies from case to case. But Ethernet is a standard, and that was Ethernet is a business model based on the de jure standard. And the entrepreneurs, of which there have been thousands, have loved that standard, and look what they've done with it. My favorite joke about that is that by 1982, there were people buying Ethernet whom I had not met personally. By 1985, there were people inventing Ethernet whom I had not met personally, and it's been a long time since then, but all in the context of the context of a standard. The core of the Ethernet business model is a de jure, not de facto, a de jure, nor a de ibmo. I don't know if you've ever heard of de ibmo standards. Token ring was a de ibmo standard. It was neither present in the market, nor was it made by a standards body. It was made by IBM. And Ethernet eventually killed it, thank goodness. So de jure, de facto, de ibmo standard. Yeah.
And so the question is, what key standards need to be put in early so that this distributed grid and energy environment works together and safely? And those, I think, are some things we can all agree we'd like to have. Right? And yet, anything you try to propose now will be fought tooth and claw by many entrepreneurs.
Oh no, but not principally by the entrepreneurs. They'll be fought by the status quo.
Well,
so when Ethernet was coming, SNA was the enemy.
X25.
X25, DECnet. The status quo is the biggest threat. They'll put the wrong standards in. But it's better to have the wrong standards and then move off them to have no standards at all. So I was advocating an architectural approach to the internet grid, and that would involve the making of standards, and there'll be mistakes made, and there'll be multiple standards, and there'll be a mess for a while, and there'll be a Ethernet token ring fight for 20 years. Those two things fought.
There wasn't a fight for the core operation of the net. That's not an obvious derivative of funding the research sites, because ISO was also a lot of research activity and standards. There wasn't an operational ISO network, whereas there was an operational ARPANET internet. And that was because of a particular cultural approach to organizing the research, but still letting it go in a lot of independent ways. And that wasn't in your slide, and yet it's actually often considered a major contribution of the sort of the culture of how the internet came about.
Yeah, the way, and I'll add that. I'll add that to my presentation almost immediately before I leave the room. But you're right, and so for example, the way I distinguish ISO from TCP IP was that ISO, which was a creature of the status quo. It was IBM and AT&T who made that, and they were all into certification, whereas IETF was all into interoperability. So you would end up with a bunch of ISO certified products that could not talk to each other. But that wouldn't happen in the IETF world where you built things and tried them out. So yeah, I think
that was Dave Clark's quote about we reject kings and voting in favor of rough consensus and loose work codes.
Dave Clark has been right a lot. So I will add that slide. So I'll try to hunt you down for the exact phrasing and the good graphic that I showed. I'm not sure what it was.
You know, one of the interesting problems is the distribution of energy, particularly electrical energy, and there's lots of pressure now for a smart grid system. They try to minimize the 50% or more of the electrical power that's generated that never gets to the intended user. But I just saw recently a notice from Cisco saying that they thought that the market was 10 times or more larger than perhaps the entire internet itself, because this is a major control market, very large, very complex distributed computation problem, on top of getting the electrons to the intended destination in an efficient way. So maybe that the analogy is much closer than you think. That the power distribution grid might just become the internet, or something like that.
Yeah, and So to that point, we've noticed that our, as electronics has sped up, the timeframes of energy usage, the peak to average ratios, peak to average, are going up. That is, and supplies of energy, solar and wind intermittent, they are statistical. And the way we solve that problem in the internet is with packet switching, which was able to connect lots of randomness here and lots of randomness here. Well, the randomness in power is going up, and our so we're going to go into the, I think, I didn't see the Cisco thing, but were they referring to the fact that you have to control all these power points in buildings?
That and also the switches and where the power gets generated and how it gets distributed out to people who are requesting it. Because you have to ensure that you transfer the amount of energy you need over this sort of irregular and strangely connected grid.
So to the list that I've already just added to, I would add the notion of dealing with high peak to average ratios, which was a phenomenon in the internet. We're so good now that we actually go in between the syllables that we speak, and we harvest all of that unused time to increase the peak to average ratio of what we transmit. So we're lowering the average and increasing the peak. Well, the same is true of, there's people doing stuff in between cycles of the light bulbs here. So the peak to average of power is going up. And so that would be an architectural principle akin to the cultural one, akin to the layering, akin to that. So you all should be working on this with me here to find all these analogies and trying to get the grid built sooner and better than it would otherwise be.
I think Cisco's already on it.
Cisco is now part of the status quo. There was a time when it was a revolutionary startup, but now it is the status quo. So you should be suspicious.
Yeah. Well, David's left, so he can't defend this.
Sir.
Two quick ones on this point. Obviously, high peak to average means store.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.